Well, folks, welcome back to Performance Process, a long overdue episode after, well, what was an extended break over the Christmas period and into January. The podcast is back now, you'll be glad to hear, and we've got a fascinating episode lined up today. I actually recorded this episode back in November. It's with Ken Ballhause, who is now the head of Biomechanics at Q36.5 Pro Cycling Team, or I should say now Pinarello Q36.5 Pro Cycling Team. You might remember Ken, he joined us on a podcast back in 2024, I think, discussing the future of aero with John Pittman. And today's conversation, it sort of gets into a question that I've had rattling around in my brain for a while, and that is if we should, or if we could potentially benefit from adapting our positions, and I'm talking about road bike position here, and specifically for road racing, to the demands of individual races or stages or events. I think this sort of concept, of this idea, first came to me way back in 2013. I was sitting in a hotel room in Kortrijk, Belgium, sharing a room with Glenn O'Shea, who our Australian listeners will no doubt know of from his team pursuit days with the Australian team at the London Olympics he went to, and then he was coach of the team for a long time after that. I was sitting watching cyclocross, and I think Sven Nys was on punditry duties, and he was talking about how sometimes he would drop his saddle a little bit for exceptionally muddy courses, and if I'm remembering correctly, and that just helped him better generate power or get through the thick mud that they would encounter on course. And yeah, it took a similar idea now into this question, and it sort of stems also just from I think the old thinking was that, you know, time trial positions were much further forward and much more aggressive, and that was fine because time trials are typically short. But my thinking has always been, well, if we ignore the front end and the aero extensions in the time trial position, but the saddle position, presumably that is arrived upon in terms of what is the most efficient way to produce power when it's just us ourselves against the clock trying to get from the start line to the finish line as quickly as possible. And yeah, the thinking I've had was just, well, if that's the most efficient saddle position, why then are we adopting a different position for the road? And so we sort of get into a bit of that, if there are benefits to different saddle positions for flatter courses, for lead out duty, for days in the high mountains, and how saddle positions have trended more towards these time trial positions anyway. And then the idea of, well, could we adapt our position based on if or a rider's role or intended performance for a given stage or parkour? And initially, Ken's answer was no. We just need better equipment, and so we expand on that, and then that sort of takes us into a bit of a rabbit hole into many different ways that bike fitting has changed of late. How Ken is now working with the pro riders that he works with, and how their setups are changing. How he identifies what might be an optimal setup for those riders, and sort of dig into some of the long-held beliefs and maybe not even beliefs, but just processes that bike fitters have used, and if they still stand up to scrutiny in what is now 2026 and with all the changes that we've seen in bike fit. So with that said, probably best just to get on with the conversation and welcome Ken back to Performance Process. Well, Ken, welcome back to the show. Thanks for joining us here again.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
You were on our listeners will know your voice from an episode around about this time last year when we ended up talking about I think we titled that one The Future of Aero, and yourself and John Pittman were on, and we were discussing all things sync, ergonomics, extensions and that. But you're joining us today in a different capacity. You're now head of biomechanics with Q36.5 Pro Cycling Team. Do you want to give the listeners a bit of an insight into what your role is there?
Yeah, correct. So at the start of 2025, I took a job with Q36.5 Pro Cycling as head of biomechanics. So yeah, going on from, well, sync ergonomics, which ultimately grew out of my background in biomechanics and bike fitting. I spent 10 years building up a business, Adaptive Human Performance, which continues today. And I work alongside that business still today. I guess as that business evolved, my work sort of slowly moved into more equipment and the ergonomics of time trial handlebars, which is what Sync Ergonomics offers. And yeah, as I kind of moved out of the space of doing, I guess what you'd describe as retail bike fitting, I ended up landing in a job with Q36.5 doing the bike fitting for the team, which includes a combination of bike fitting as well as aero testing for position optimization, aero testing for equipment development. And then the other part of my role is also strategic equipment choice for event specific demands. So yeah, it's, I guess, a combination of everything that I've done over the past 10 years, sort of condensed into just working with one team of athletes, which is quite nice.
Well, yeah, sounds interesting for sure. You mentioned strategic equipment choices for different events. I want to just hop onto that for a second because it in some way gets to the conversation we're about to have, but maybe just give listeners an insight. What does that mean?
Yeah, so I guess when you look at time trial specifically, that's probably the easiest way to view it. You've got short time trials, you've got long time trials. Short time trial is generally at a higher speed than a long time trial, and that has a different requirement for chainring size, different gearing options, different skin suit choice. Then if you extend that further to team time trial, which is typically, again, over a fairly short distance at an even higher speed, that then places even more demands on gearing choice and also, garment choice as well.
And so you're analyzing courses and riders and team makeups before an event and predicting which equipment would be best suited to each individual course?
Yeah, so it usually starts with aero testing because that gives you a CDA number for the rider. Once you've got the CDA number for the rider, you can then use some analysis tools to predict what their race speed is going to be or what their speed is going to be on critical sections of the course. And then that informs, obviously, the driveline options that you're going to need to go with. But then also, for us, we use different skin suits for different speeds. So we then choose a skin suit that's correct for the speed that we're predicting the rider is going to go. And then I guess if you take it one step further with the Vuelta this year on the final time trial, that was originally going to be a longer stage and then it ended up being a shorter stage. So that, kind of changed our approach for skin suit with Tom for that day, for example. Yeah, as just one kind of recent example of how that fits in.
It's a good example, isn't it? How you...
Yeah. Yeah, I guess the Vuelta this year was quite dynamic in those changing stages. But that's also not dissimilar to other events. If you've got, different wind conditions or, say, for example, it rains, that's going to change the outlook of the event.
You mentioned aero testing there as well, and there's our worlds have been colliding quite randomly of late, and I think you and I first met in Adelaide 2 years ago, but as we were prepping this podcast, you were mentioning that Kurt Bogarts is now your you report to Kurt. He's head of performance on Q36.5, and he was head of the team that I rode for 6 years. And actually I just recorded a podcast yesterday with John Buckley of Streamlines, and again your name came up and you've mentioned aero testing there, and I think it's the Streamlines system that you're using for that aero testing. Is that right?
Yeah, correct. So Streamlines is the system that we've gone with. I guess I'm of the opinion that Streamlines is the most developed software and hardware application for that purpose. And it works really well for the in-field aero testing that we do. Yeah, I've done a fair bit of, I guess what I'd describe as field-based aero testing, velodrome aero testing, over the last 10 years with Alpha Mantis. And Streamlines is, I guess, kind of the next evolution of that approach, obviously with different hardware, and applied in the real world outside, not restrained to a velodrome. Yeah.
Well, we're here today because I had messaged you. I had this idea for a podcast in my head, and I thought you might be the person to speak to on it. And that turned out to be very, very, very much an accurate assumption, because my question was, we as road cyclists, we typically have one road bike fit, one position that we adopt, regardless of the terrain or stage that we're racing through. And my question was sort of like, I wonder if there are opportunities for sort of performance and maybe adopting a different position based on the stage profile. So the example I had given you was rider might be riding in the mountains one day and they would have one position, but then the next day they're on lead out duty for the sprinter, and that lead out position might be very different, might be, you know, more aggressive so they can adapt a more aerodynamic position, maybe move forward, might require a change of handlebars or stems or something like that. But yeah, basically, should we be adopting a range of different positions? And you had a quick answer for me.
Yeah. I guess it's a complicated question, and my simple short answer was for a World Tour cyclist, the answer would be no, not really. But it wouldn't really be fair just to shut the question down with no. So I guess my perspective is that you should be able to support the biomechanical requirements of an athlete through their equipment. So the example that I can give for that is, yes, a Grand Tour rider is going to have to be aero in some instances, and they're also going to have to be on the bike for, 200Ks being a fairly long stage, and they're going to have to do 21 stages effectively back to back. Their equipment needs to support them being in an aero position. It needs to support them being on the bike for long stints, and it's going to need to support them going up hills. And I'm pretty firmly of the belief that you can do that through just the correct equipment choice. Specifically, that comes back to crank length. It comes back to saddle choice. It comes back to, the nuances of how you set up the shifters on the handlebars to provide them with the support that they need for their positioning. Yeah, I don't think that you need to resort to having different positions, because that ultimately throws a whole lot of complexity for teams with mechanics. It's hard enough to keep on top of one rider's single set of measurements, let alone trying to introduce 2 or maybe even 3 different road bike setups. That would be pretty hard to try and manage. But yeah, from a practical standpoint, I think that it can be done through equipment ergonomics and athlete positioning.
I guess my initial thought process was like, when I was racing internationally 10 years ago now at this point, most riders were like hyper fixated on their positions, and we used to think that if we wore thicker socks we could feel it in our saddle heights, and if our saddle was off by 1 millimeter we were going to come down with some career ending injury because it had changed. But the more I thought about it then, I was like, well, nowadays we have a time trial bike and a road bike position that are entirely different, and the riders will do a 200-kilometer road stage and then warm down on the time trial bike, and lo and behold, they don't get injured. And then Matthew van der Poel or other riders will be hopping on the XC bike at times, they'll be on the cyclocross bike, they'll be on gravel bikes, and then they're back onto the road bike, and maybe all in the 1 week. And maybe Tom Pidcock on your own team is a better example there. But so I was like, right, well, we have the capacity to support different positions. Is that fair enough to say, or is there more than meets the eye than like these riders aren't just hopping from one bike to the other? Is there something they're doing there to ensure that they don't get injured? I guess is maybe the best place to start.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. There's so if you use road bike and TT bike as the easy example in that situation, yeah, I think it's a misconception that a more forward saddle position results in more knee injuries. That's the practical example that you gave just then. You don't see in triathlon, for example, triathletes having exponentially more knee injuries than a road cyclist, and triathletes are in a far more forward position for a lot longer than road cyclists. So yeah, as long as everything else is factored in, saddle height, the nuance of how the saddle is set up to ensure that someone's not slipping forward, as long as all of that is factored in, then yeah, I don't think there's an issue there around a rider getting injured from a different setup. It's not that necessary. Not in today's, I guess, climate of cycling and with the equipment that is available to most people today.
Maybe that answers my next question, but the question I've always sort of had in the back of my mind was, well, if we're setting up our time trial bikes, not the front end with the extensions, but the saddle position to be the most efficient for when we're racing against the clock, we want to get from start to finish as quickly as possible, why are we then adopting usually an entirely different saddle position on our road bikes, further back, maybe a different angle, just very different profile even in terms of the saddle itself? And I know that's changing, and that's probably where this conversation is going to go, but what was the traditional thinking in having such different saddle positions from TT to road bike?
Yeah, I guess if you just think of biomechanically the differences between those two disciplines, with a TT bike, what you're trying to do is achieve the lowest possible torso angle that you can achieve. That's how you get, the bulk of your aero gains on it. And what that results in is your center of mass or your center of gravity is so much further forward than it is on a road bike that you are always falling forward. You're always rotating around the bottom bracket. On a TT bike, you're fortunate that you've got something that you can rest your forearms on. So that is your balance point at the front of the bike. That means you're less aware of how far forward you are on the bike. If you were to try and use the same saddle and the same saddle position on a road bike without having that inherent support under your forearms, it would be hard to do it for the duration that you need to do it.
You're going to get pretty sore wrists
in road cycling. Yeah. You're talking, even if it's a classics rider, right? So if we move away from the idea of a grand tour of 21 days of racing and you look at a classics rider, you're still talking more than 5 hours on a bike at a time. Milan San Remo, 6.5 hours. Aruba, 5.5 hours. Strata, what's that? Maybe 5.25, 5.5 hours. That's a long time to be in a position. And if you are so far forward that you're putting all of, or a lot of your body weight on your hands, that's not going to be A, particularly good for handling, and B, you're probably not going to get to the end of the event very comfortably. Yeah, there's, maybe a crit race might be an example of where you could get away with a very extreme setup on a bike, closer to a time trial position. But, that's not really Grand Tour racing. That's not really World Tour racing. So then, I guess the way that a road bike setup has always been done is, well, how do you support those demands? How do you support 6.5 hours of racing? You need to have a center of mass that is further back, more naturally balanced over the bike so that you're not placing so much weight on your hands. And more of that weight is going through the saddle. And that's, I guess, they're your two extremes. Weight through the saddle versus high percentage of your weight going through your arms. Yeah, if that answers the question.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, it's not, while it might be fine for a crit, you couldn't sustain that sort of, especially like on the wrists and the palms of the hands and that over 21 days of a Grand Tour.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Nevertheless, though, like you've already mentioned there, good equipment allows you to adopt a position that is suitable across varied terrain and varied stages that these riders are tackling. You had mentioned the saddle specifically when we were prepping for this, but do you want to just delve into what you meant by that then? If the answer isn't different positions, the answer is equipment. What does that mean?
Yeah, so and I guess the example that I gave just before with the biomechanical demands of time trialing, it's all about trying to support the lowest possible torso angle. The way that you support the torso being as low as it can be is through the pelvis tilting forward on the seat. So the purpose of a cutout on the saddle is to allow the pelvis to tilt forward. And obviously a time trial position is the most extreme example of that. So a time trial saddle invariably should have a wide nose and the largest of cutouts. And as your torso angle gets higher and higher, approaching more like a road cycling position, the demand for that width of the nose of the seat is a little bit less. The demand for the size of the cutout is a little bit less because you're not trying to support as much pelvic tilt. You still want to support it. And that's, I guess, the difference between a biomechanically not very well considered road bike saddle and a well considered road bike saddle is how well the seat supports the pelvis tilting forward. If you can match that to your requirement for pelvic tilt and a low torso, then yeah, you can be comfortable and achieve the position that you need to achieve.
So you're doing all the fits for the Q36.5 riders, and specifically talking about road bike fits here. Have you got a go-to saddle, like a saddle concept maybe rather than a specific model, or is it a case of here's a saddle that will work for everybody?
Basically, the closer you are to a time trial position, the broader the nose needs to be. So when you talk saddle concept, yeah, like the saddle should have a wide nose, a saddle should have a cutout, because those are the features that support the position that the pelvis should be in when you're cycling. But the nuance of that is the closer you are to a time trial position, the wider the nose should be and the bigger the cutout should be. The closer you are to a road cycling position, the less requirement there is for that. In terms of, is there one saddle that works for everyone? Absolutely not. But I think that what that comes back to more is the width of the rider's pelvis. So obviously someone that has a really wide pelvis, they're going to be sitting on a broader seat. Someone that has a really narrow pelvis, they're going to be sitting on a much narrower saddle. And also it's hard to have a wide nose to your seat if it's a small seat, right? So the idea of, a massive nose and a big cutout, which is obviously what I sort of aspire to, it doesn't practically work for everyone. And especially when you've got a smaller athlete, has a smaller pelvis, and obviously the nose has to be smaller than it otherwise could be. So yeah, it is, saddle choice is a hard topic, especially when you've got riders that are, mature professional cyclists that have probably sat on 3 or 4 different saddles, and they've got their favorite, they've got their one that, got them through a season without too many saddle sores. But yeah, conceptually, I think the idea of a saddle that has a reasonable size cutout, the maximum that it can be for any one individual, and a saddle that adequately provides the width that they need to support their pelvis. If you could tie those into one seat, then yeah, that would be a saddle concept.
I want to get back to the cutout in a second, but I noticed that you were saying pelvis width and not sit bone width. Should I read anything into that?
Probably not. I guess your sit bones are not what you sit on when you sit on a bike seat. If you were sitting on your sit bones, you would be practically bolt upright on the bike. And there's not many people riding hybrid bikes in the Pro Peloton.
Yeah, I was going to say there is a certain scenario where that would be fine riding to the shops or something, but not riding to a finish line.
No. So the structure of your pelvis that you sit on is your pubic ramus, which is further forward than your ischial tuberosity, which is classically your sit bone. That is narrower than the 2 points of your sit bones, which you're trying to pick up when you sit on one of the various devices that measures your sit bone width. There would be a relationship between the width of your sit bones and the width of your pubic ramus. But the way that I work, I think I work very practically rather than having tools that don't really measure anything and then trying to infer some information from that. I would rather look at how someone sits on a saddle on a bike and gauge whether they need a wider seat or a narrower seat. I think that's a more direct way of understanding the individual's requirement for saddle width.
I'm assuming there's no similarly easy way to measure the width of the pelvis or the pubic rami.
No, it's a pretty personal area of the body.
Yeah.
I don't think you'd really want to stick your fingers or a measuring device in there to measure that. Would it actually tell you the width of the seat? No. Like again, I think I work very practically. And I think also when you do bike fitting kind of at that retail commercial level where you're crunched for time, you always find ways to do your job efficiently. And the way that I've found to do that job efficiently is just to get someone on the seat. Because obviously there's other things than just saddle width that you're trying to, ask someone questions about. So yeah, I think it's easiest to address that topic with an athlete sitting on a bike.
Yeah, that is the reason why I asked, because, you go for a bike fit these days, step one seems to be you sit on a sit bone width measuring pad, and from there, saddle width is determined for you. But yeah, I've increasingly been of the opinion that I was curious as to why we measure sit bones, because we don't actually sit on our sit bones unless we're, hands off the bars changing a rain jacket or something like that. It's not something we tend to engage in a performance road bike position, I don't think.
Yeah, and I think that what I would have noticed over the years is that method tends to over-predict the width requirement that an individual has, and potentially for that reason, because you're measuring a point that is far wider where you actually sit. So yeah, I guess from that perspective, it's not a surprise that people end up on seats that are too wide for them. And there is actually a real downside to that. The downside is that when the seat is too wide, it tends to drive the person forward onto the nose of the saddle, and they're not actually sitting on the seat in the intended spot where the pressure relief channel is where it needs to be. So yeah, it's a very relevant consideration in saddle choice.
One of the other sort of standard practice now seems to be to put a pressure mapping pad onto the saddle as part of a bike fit. I'm going to ask you about that because I think it'll get us back to why the saddle should have a cutout, or the saddle concept you described earlier should have a cutout. Do you use pressure mapping, or is that not part of the sort of process that you just described?
Yeah, I don't use pressure mapping. I can definitely see the application for pressure mapping in the design of seat and I guess evaluating the concept of the saddle. The reason, and I guess this comes back again to what I describe as a very practical approach to bike fitting. The reason I don't use pressure mapping in the work that I do is I've seen over the years that it's very easy to cheat the pressure mapping system. When you measure pressure on the seat, there's a lot of freedom up the chain that can influence the pressure. So the way that someone sits changes the pressure distribution on the saddle. Their spinal kinematics, or how much flexion that they're in through the spine, which then is the driver of pelvic tilt, that influences the pressure mapping result on the saddle. So if you, as the rider, feels pressure in a spot that you don't want to feel pressure, you're going to avoid it. You're not going to sit into that pressure. So instinctively, there are ways that you can actively avoid the pressure and manipulate the result of the pressure mapping. So in terms of how I work through that, I would get someone to sit on the seat in the way that I expect they should be able to sit on the seat with good posture, and ask them the question directly, where do you feel pressure? And lo and behold, the human body is pretty good at understanding where it feels pressure. So it's not that I don't appreciate what that technology can bring to the table. I just don't see it as being overly relevant in the work that I've done over the years. And I don't actually think it would contribute to the outcome if you know what you're searching for, and if you know what the questions are that you need to ask to get the same information.
For some of the work that I do, I would love to have a pressure mapping pad, just for various bits and pieces that I do for Escape. But I think, is it Goddard's law? When a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure, and I think that's kind of the case with pressure mapping systems, where instead of just being one data point, it's increasingly, I see it, chatting to someone who's been for a bike fit, and they'll say, oh yeah, I've used this pressure mapping system, and the bike fitter told me that I needed to get the pressure points back onto my sit bones and back to the back of the saddle, and because it was showing a build up of pressure on the nose around the perineum, and instead of that being an indication, we need to get rid of the pressure there, so we'll use a saddle with a cutout. It's how do we angle the saddle to get the pressure back on the rear end of it. And I think then that leads us into the next part of this conversation, which was actually the first part of this conversation, that you need a saddle that allows you to rotate your hips forwards, not...
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I think that any tool in the wrong hands can be a dangerous piece of equipment, right? And I guess also I've seen plenty of bike fits done purely off pressure mapping without any of the real measures that should be taking place during a bike fit, which is more of the joint angle data. So yeah, it has a place, but probably a limited place, and more in the area of product development.
The bigger point, or where we're trying to get to here, I think, is just that, as I've been saying since I did a podcast with Nick from Wove Saddles last year, that a saddle that allows you to rotate your pelvis forward and doesn't at the same time lead to a buildup of pressure in that soft tissue region that then allows you to get into and sustain, and helps you sustain a lower torso angle, or a more aerodynamic position, we might describe it as, is sort of where I think we both agree saddles should be going. And that was your answer to me, is like, you don't need to be changing your position for different stages. You just need a saddle that allows you to adopt that position when you want it, or sit back and sit upright when you need to as well.
Yeah, exactly. And I feel like saddles have evolved meaningfully over the past few years. And I guess the first kind of step in that direction for road saddles was maybe the specialized power saddle with the shorter nose, because obviously the length of the nose also contributes to that pressure. So yeah, specialized power, then maybe the Pro Stealth saddle, maybe the Bontrager Aeolus, all those, I guess, early adopters of the short nose concept, progressed saddle design in that direction. I think that is, it's helpful for achieving a more aero ride cycling position. It's helpful for facilitating the pelvis to tilt forward and allowing the torso to be lower. But I guess the extra kind of layer on top of that is over the past couple of years, saddles have also evolved to be a little more round. So if you look at a saddle front on from the nose, the shoulders that sort of meet the gluteal fold at the back, that area of the saddle has evolved to now be a little more round than it was, say, 4 or 5 years ago. And I think that is also a really helpful sort of design characteristic that has made saddles generally more comfortable.
How does that help?
I find that when a saddle is too flat, if you're looking at a saddle nose on at the shoulders, if a saddle is too flat, you kind of end up with these 2 points that give you a pressure concentration where your gluteal fold meets that area of the saddle. And that is one thing that can drive you forward on the seat. Doesn't allow you to sit back on the body of the saddle. So it can be a source of saddle sore or friction, irritation over time. And just also a feature on the saddle that doesn't really accommodate you sitting back on the body of the seat. Yeah, I feel like that is just as important as the width of the saddle in terms of allowing you to comfortably sit over the body of the saddle. But then it would also be possible for a saddle to kind of be too round and for the apex of that roundness to kind of hit you in a region where you don't want that pressure.
Yeah, I remember at one point one of the Italian brands, Physique, I think, had a very, very round saddle, maybe going back about 10 years ago. And I never actually sat in it, but I think Gilbert used it at one point, and it was a very interesting looking shape. I don't think they do it anymore, but yeah, I can see how a saddle could be too round also.
Yeah.
Okay, folks, that's where we're cutting off the free version of this podcast this week. Just a reminder, if you head over to escapecollective.com/member, you can sign up now and you can get the entire podcast uninterrupted. You'll not have me butting in to cut you off or to remind you that you're not yet a member. And in doing so, you will be helping to ensure this podcast continues for many more episodes and months and years to come. So head over escapecollective.com/member now to sign up to Escape Collective and to get the entire episode of Performance Process along with all of the other podcasts and written content that we publish on our website.